Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Justice recently announced, and I quote, an increase of available funding and, I again quote, new funding for victims of crime. But it is not new. The surplus in the Victim of Crime Fund has been growing for years. Victim of crime organizations have been prevented from accessing their own money. The money was mandated to benefit victims of crime funds all along. Why has this money been withheld all these years, and why is it now announced as new money only months before an election?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the slightly misguided question. So we have, in fact, made additional monies available to the victims of crime organizations. Several of those organizations were standing with me as we announced that, Mr. Speaker. It is the case that over the course of more than a decade now, there has been a surplus accumulating. Unfortunately, governments previous to ours had done no work around what the needs of victims were, how to meet those needs, how to measure whether we were meeting those needs. So the Auditor General asked us to do lots of that work before we were able to increase the funding to those organizations, Mr. Speaker. We've now done that work, and we're happy to announce the increase.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. First supplemental.
Given that rural communities are in an epidemic of crime that has been escalating for years, rural victims deserve support. Yet this access, or the access to victim funds is for 5 urban municipalities only and no rural regions. This is patently inequitable and unjust. And further, given that rural municipalities' resolution this spring called upon the Government of Alberta to use the money from the Victim of Crime Fund to adequately fund provincial victim services units, why have rural regions been excluded?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So there were multiple things that were announced in the announcement recently. Some of them were funding for the most strapped victim services. So we worked with the organization that represents all of the victim services organization, and they said where the greatest need was, and therefore we flowed additional funding to those particular instances. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, there was an increase in funding for certain victims of crime areas that deal with certain Indigenous areas as well. So we've increased the support to those units that are supporting those Indigenous areas, which include rural units, Mr. Speaker.
Second supplemental.
Mr. Speaker, given that the Auditor General, in fact, has called upon the government to, and I quote, develop a plan that identifies the actual current needs of the victim of crime population and that identifies gaps in the services, and much of that victim population is, in fact, rural, and given that the crime-ridden rural regions have reduced access to victim services and depend on heroic volunteers who are now excluded from this plan, why does this government think it's acceptable to exclude the many repeated traumatized rural victims?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There was a lot in there, but I'd like to just say that I'm incredibly proud of the work we've been doing with the victims of crime organizations. Mr. Speaker, as the member has correctly identified, the Auditor General made recommendations arising from the fact that our predecessors had failed to do any of that work to identify the needs of victims. Mr. Speaker, we have now identified that. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to note that we are extremely concerned about rural crime, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're funding a plan that's already working. Meanwhile, the opposition voted against that plan.